First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Gudavarthy. He seems to have written a book that is extremely useful. And my impression after reading the book is that this is a book that should be read by people on the left, by people on the right, and both would in a way benefit a lot from it. Now, the important part of the book is that it is not simply looking at the what and then rejecting it. So generally, like having been an alumnus of JNU, I've known this campus for the last 21 odd years. So there is a kind of a tendency because we, for instance, here were a very ideological campus, which also often made us a very polarized campus. So an ideological othering would often take place wherein there was an attempt not to engage. So rejection is in fact an escape route, but there are no social escape routes. So one has to engage all ideas. And the same thing applies to the right. The kind of, calling the left anti-national is also an escape route and a rejection. Now here, Dr. Gudavarthy is trying to look at the why. Why is it that we see a certain turn towards populism and the rise of the right wing? Of course, the connection he brings about with neoliberalism is something that has already been discussed. So I would, in a way, the book, as one reads it, is basically a combination of several arguments and insights. And many of those insights are very substantive. Of course, I have some disagreements in some cases. So I'll just try to, run through some of those insights that he talks about. One argument that Dr. Gudavarthy gives, which is a very important argument, and this would be certainly very important for the left, for instance, to understand. He says that there is a notion of hurt pride among caste groups that were either upper caste or would be ritually intermediate but dominant castes. The hurt pride is coming from a lack of opportunity, a feeling of being left out. And in this, he argues, in fact, at one point I would also disagree with him. He says that there is no case of Islamophobia in India. He says the Muslim ends up being the easiest enemy. It's like a battle that is won before it's fought, because the Muslim as the other is a small minority. Now the point is, I would disagree with him here, because I would say that India, at least since the colonial times, it's also possible that it might be true about India even before colonial times. But since I have never researched pre-colonial times in terms of primary sources, I cannot say anything that is very sure there. But certainly I have researched colonial India and this very question. So I would suggest that India has, at least since the 19th century, had two competing meta-discourses. So there has been a meta-discourse that has sought to other Muslims, or among Muslims that has sought to see the Hindus as the other. And parallelly, there has also been a discourse, very, very imaginatively constructed, that talked about a composite culture. So I would say that one strand of opinion in India, as was constructed over the last 100, 150 years at the least, has a certain fear of the Muslim as its base, but that is not the only strand. There's always a competing strand that has sought to talk about India not as a kind of a foundationally Hindu country, but as a country that is a result of a composite culture. So here, in fact, in one of his last chapters, when he's talking about the oscillating public sphere in India, I would also suggest that what he's calling the oscillating public sphere, he says that it's so strange that in a context where one sees a rise of intolerance, where one sees a certain right-wing surge, a movie like Bajrangi Bhaijaan or PK becomes a super hit, right? So he talks about oscillation. I would say that people in India, by and large, who are exposed to public discourse, as most citizens are, they have always been, at least in the last 100, 150 years, been subject to two competing worldviews. So it is only the ideologue who actually, tactically sides with only one worldview. The beauty of the ideologue is that the ideologue is often very close-minded. People who are not ideologues are often, subject to different kinds of influences and it is a given context that may make one kind of influence more powerful. So at one level, the surge of the right wing in that sense, and he explains the reasons for it, is also about a context where we are situated, in which the discourse of Hinduism as foundational to India and the Muslim as the other has become more powerful. Of course, it is reversible. There was also a time when, say, Gandhi was the leader of the national movement, that for many Hindus, despite partition, Hindu nationalism could not really take off. Having said that, I would also kind of add to it when he talks about the herd pride question. He talks about a mezzanine elite, which is maybe a group of castes, for instance, who are proud of themselves. It could be Brahmins who are poor, it could be Patidars, it could be Marathas, who have a sense of pride, but they are also feeling left out. Now he very correctly says that the right has been able to, in different ways, address that. Now the addressing may not be a substantive addressing. It could be something as simple as, aligning with a particular kind of demand at a particular movement, right? For example, the polarization that happened in Western UP around Muzaffarnagar, there was an alliance with the Jats that happened. The Jats had never been, in that sense, strong supporters of the BJP, but it happened. But he says that the left has absolutely no discourse that is available with them to address this mezzanine elite. So the left, he's very correct there, the left can at best say that, this is a part of a feudal backwardness. So that becomes a problem. For instance, I remember the time I had already left JNU, but I used to visit the campus quite often. There was a rise of the Youth for Equality. So Youth for Equality was a movement I profoundly disagreed with, right? So I always thought that, to oppose reservation is in a way a very regressive step. You could maybe talk about making it more complex, but opposing is something wrong. But I would notice, in my experience, that many of my friends to the left would have a very strange kind of argument. So once I was talking to some friends from ISA in Brahmaputra hostel, and they were looking at a pamphlet of Y for E, and they said that these people talk about merit, they can't even write correct English. So I asked this left friend of mine, is correct English something that is a direct gift of God to you? Or is it your language is also a sign of your access to resources since childhood? What kind of schooling you have had, how educated your parents are. I asked that friend of mine, why is it that the Youth for Equality, apparently the upper caste bastion, is populated by many students who are upper caste but obviously lacking in opportunity? And why is it that some people in the left might be extremely articulate, and that articulation in that sense is a function of the cultural resource they've had? So now the point is that, there has to be a discourse, there has to be a discourse that addresses many groups that in a way feel left out and that also feel proud. And let's not forget one thing, when you don't have anything else, what remains with you is pride. So while it would sound very politically incorrect, a Rajput security guard outside an ATM in Rajasthan, what else does he have except pride or maybe an upturned mustache? So the point is, when you don't have access to resources, and the whole neoliberal connection also is very important. There's an agrarian distress, as Professor Patnaik said, and that has its impacts. Now, one more thing that a very important point that he brings out is how there has been a shift from institutions to the notion of a strong man. And here, in a very strange sense, the discourse of class, as Professor Patnaik said, that the discourse of class is not dead, it may come back again. But right-wing populism in India has come on the back of a very strange kind of a discourse of class. So this is a new kind of a belief in the haves and the have-nots, where if you talk to people who are educated but not maybe too much into higher education, you will come across people who have a certain common sense. The common sense is that institutions in India were always for the privileged few, and there was a Nehruvian elite that ensured that some privileged people who happened to be liberals and very Western in their outlook completely swarmed the institutions, and this left the other people out, right? So in that sense, the institution itself, it could be Reserve Bank of India, it could be Jawaharlal Nehru University, it could be Delhi University, it could be St. Stephen's College. The institution itself becomes the other. The institution is a hindrance to a vague sense of social democracy. And in that sense, the Nehru-Gandhi family becomes, the standing symbol of a Nehruvian elitism in which institutions that are supposed to sustain democracy become enemies of democracy. So, in that sense, he very rightly brings about a strange kind of a binary or a kind of a dichotomy has been created. There is a strong man and there are the institutions. The strong man stands for the public, the people, and the institution is somehow ranged against the people. So now, being extra-institutional is not a threat to democracy. Rather, it is a correction of a kind of a very strangely feudal democracy that was operating. So that becomes a strange kind of a corrective. And in that, when the strong man who's the leader stands for the people, who are the people? That's a very important point that he makes. The people does not mean all citizens from India. The people are people who are authentic people. So the authentic people are necessarily generally Hindus, or I would say maybe even Sikhs can be authentic people, maybe Jains can be authentic people. But the possibility of the Muslim being part of the authentic people is a bit low, unless the Muslim is maybe Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam or someone like that. There is a certain precondition attached to being authentic. On the other hand, the authentic people are those masses who've been left out of these liberal institutions. So the Indian liberal in that sense is not part of the authentic people. He says it very correctly, the left is not part of the authentic people. So an attack on people who are not authentic is not something that has to be seen as a danger, rather it is a part of the correction. So the attack on JNU in that sense fits into the fact that JNU had been an institution for long that was not authentic in that sense. Authentic, and JNU of course has been very left of center. That's a different matter. So so this also explains the question of violence. Now another very important point that he brings about. How is it that a Hindu unity is being sought to be constructed amid a maze of castes? Because Hinduism to an extent is hierarchically arranged, or at least arranged in terms of difference. So a very important argument that he brings about is that this Hindu unity is based on fragmentation. Now he's got a very good critique, another thing that I agree with, because that is what I saw as a journalist touring Uttar Pradesh. For instance, the Mandal experiment. It actually led to aspirations among sections of OBC's rise, but over 20 years there came a perception that Mandal politics had become the politics of a few dominant OBC castes. Now this left out several smaller, weaker OBC castes, and what has been done very successfully by the BJP in UP, for instance, is that they reached out to these small groups, the Mauryas, the Kurmis, and the Kashyaps in Western UP. Now the point is that it is this kind of a recognition plus representation. At one level it gives you recognition because you ally with Hinduism, which is a big religion with Hindutva, and on the other hand it also gives you more representation. And one advantage that the BJP has, which no other party has, is that when the BJP gives tickets, the BJP can afford to give 0 to Muslims. Any other party would never be able to open that representation because they would be, out of 403 in UP for instance, Mayawati gave 100 tickets to Muslims. But BJP has always a surplus of maybe 40 to 50 seats, despite the fact that it has already represented upper castes. And that surplus actually goes to those groups that are seeking representation, and thereby gets constructed a unity in fragmentation, which is again reversible. So I'll now kind of close down what I'm saying. One more thing that I would certainly want to say, the last important point, he talks about the problem of retrieval, which is very important, and everyone in the left at least should, or liberals in India should think about that. There has been a tendency, before I close, let me say that, there has been a tendency to look at everything ancient in terms of philosophy as Brahminical, right? So Brahminical has become an easy word that can be, it's like anti-national. So its precise meanings can be, it's open-ended. So what he says is that, is it possible to look at some trends of ancient Indian thought that may be outside the pale of Brahminism? And let me end by saying I agree with him there, because composite culture as an experiment as envisaged by Gandhi or even Nehru, read Discovery of India, it's full of civilizational imagery. Composite culture can only succeed when we have a notion of some usefulness that Hinduism can also bring. Despite caste, despite critiques of caste that would run through Hinduism, through Sikhism, even through Islam. But the notion that we have a coexistent, coherent culture, if one reads Discovery of India, it is a meaningful Hinduism and a meaningful Islam, a meaningful Sikhism combining. One problem has been that in terms of discourse, much of the left, as he says, has brought about more of difference and hierarchy. So often it is very difficult to reach out to people, especially at such a juncture where there is a turn towards populism. Critiques alone would not work. A rereading of Hindu traditions would also have to be attempted, apart from, of course, pitches towards composite culture. Thanks a lot. So.